Hey everyone, welcome back to Shutter Magazine. I'm Dustin Lucas, and today I'm going to be continuing my 7-part series on how to step up your Lightroom game. This is series video number 4, talking about advanced color correction. Let's dive in. Now that we've gone through how to manage your catalog, selecting files, we are ready to color correct. So, like with everything with Lightroom, efficiency is key. We want to be using presets for global settings. Then we're going to go in image to image and start to dial in our basic panel settings. Things like white balance, exposure, highlights, shadows, and black points, really focusing on those key components when we're color correcting our files. But some things that allow you to be efficient going image to image is going to be things like sync settings. We can start by editing the first image of a sequence and syncing it to the rest of them and making our small tweaks. I'll get into the details of how that works. One of my favorite ways to edit is the divide and conquer method. So what I like to do is separate by serial numbers in my specific cameras, and I like to edit specific images, the first image of each sequence from each serial number. So that's called the divide and conquer method. And what I do is I do samples, so about 100, 110 images, editing both cameras together with like the first image of each sequence. And then when I'm done, I can go back by serial number again and I can sync from those red label files. I'll jump into that further down the road. I also have some really important tips when it comes to dialing in exposure. You can use a tool called the match total exposure. So what that does is it allows you to dial in the exposure on one image. And if you have multiple images shot in that same scene with very similar light, maybe the sun's going behind a cloud, images getting brighter, darker, or if you're shooting in like aperture priority and your exposures kind of jump around all over the place, not a problem. Match total exposure is going to change your life. There's also some really cool features in the develop module, like the reference view option, right? So if we're in the develop mode, we can pull up the reference option to throw an image in here and to go through and make sure every image matches that. So it makes it really cool to make some adjustments in the develop module while you're looking at your match or your reference edit. Very cool tools to use. And again, tips to make color correction even easier. Another really awesome tool that I like to use is the target adjustment tools. The target adjustment tool allows you to pull out very specific colors out of an image, right? So if I want to remove the blues, if I want to boost the saturation in the skin, if I want to desaturate the background, I can do all of that stuff, right? So I can really take an image from here to there. Well, of course, I've got some other adjustments applied on there as well. But we can jump into the target adjustment tool and how that applies. So here we have the ability to come in and really change the colors of this image. Like I said, we can do hue and saturation. You can do tone curve. You can also do some adjustments with the black and white mixing. But it becomes very important and efficient in my workflow to use that. So let's jump into the library and develop modules and talk about how to start there. Alright, so diving into the library module, it's very important when I start to edit is I like to use the divide and conquer method. So what I like to do is I like to pull up my library filters and I'll choose camera serial number. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through all the sequences of this specific camera and I'm going to turn the first image of each sequence red. So as you see as I go through each of these sections, I might already have some reds that I've already pre-selected maybe. But you can go through here and I'm going to choose an image through each kind of lighting change, right? So if I choose an image like this one here, it already kind of matches these images to follow, right? Let me zoom out here a little bit. So it automatically kind of matches all those. Well, now this kind of jumps to here, and even this image is similar, so I don't need to choose it. But maybe I want to choose that image. And now I'm jumping in here. I have that red image, this one, right? I'm going through each sequence and I'm choosing the first image from that sequence to make sure as I'm making my adjustments on this specific serial number, I can then go through, label after the fact, and choose all of the red label ones. Now, of course, I'm going to do this between both cameras, so I want to make sure to choose all cameras, serial numbers, and I'm going to choose red. Now, let's say this is all the red labels that I chose for this job, so that way I can go through camera to camera. Even when it's two different cameras that I'm going through, I can make sure that I'm looking at the bride shot with one camera versus the bride shot with another, and I can edit both of these images to make sure that they match, right? Those are the most important things. So as I'm going through and I'm editing them, I want to make sure all of those kind of settings start out the same, and I can make sure the bride kind of meets the same exposure settings. She's a little bit warmer here, but we can make sure even camera to camera she's dialed in to kind of help out, right? So that becomes very important. It's called the divide and conquer method. I highly recommend it when you're starting out, right? So choosing red labels, choose the first image, dividing out by each serial number, choosing the first image of each sequence and marking it in red, then going back to camera serial numbers and choosing all red labels. So you can edit all cameras and all samples together. Makes things super simple. When you're done, then you can go through and literally just sync your red label images and then make your small adjustments. Makes editing super fast. Now when I get into editing, it's really important that I break down the different panels that I like to use, right? So for me, I really like to have the history panel drop down in case I need to jump between different states of the image that I was editing. But it's also very important that I have the before and after, right? So as you can see here, reset this and swap. Typically I start with the left as the before image without anything applied, and I'm looking at my after image here on the right of what my final edit's going to look like. So I always want to make sure I have my develop module set up this way. It's a pretty simple way, but you can get rid of all your panels by holding shift and hitting tab, and then you can pull in just your develop panel, so that way you can go image to image. If you want to have the if you want to have your film strip at the bottom, of course you can choose that. I highly recommend it. And we want to make sure that our film strip is pretty small, but that way we can select images here once we dial in our exposure, of course. Once we kind of dial in those settings, then we can sync them. And all of our images shift, right? So we're going to go through here and make our small tweaks. I might come in here and add a little bit of shadows. That got a little bit brighter. Just want to make sure these images all relatively look the same. So that becomes very important, right? So you have the divide and conquer method, and you also have the before and after previews. Now something that becomes really cool in the develop module is you can use the reference edit. So I can right click on this image and set it as the reference photo. So now if I want to go through and make sure every image matches that first one, I can, right? So I can go through and immediately see, oh wow, that image looks terrible, right? So I want to bring it up. Now I don't want to go too bright with it. It's kind of part of the appeal of the image. But it allows me to go through and really dial into that specific reference photo. So I can do all those kind of adjustments, right, that I need to do, but it lets me keep that image on the left as my match or my reference edit. Pretty awesome. So let's jump into presets, right? It's all about presets when it's Lightroom, and get into how to create one and apply them. Alright, so this section is called presets, presets, presets. And what I mean by that are develop presets. It is so important to use presets when it comes to editing, right? So in Lightroom, we can apply global settings to all of our images, and what those are called, those global settings are applied using a preset, right? So it's really simple to create a preset. So if you already have kind of a recipe or something that you like to apply, you can make sure that those settings are saved and applied to every image globally. So I'm just going to kind of go through here and put together what I typically apply for some of my images in general. And what I like to do is I like to Add a little dehaze, a little bit of vibrance. If I want to kind of drop some of the saturation and skin tones, lift the skin tones a bit. Just some simple stuff. I can go in here, details, noise reduction at 10, sharpening at 60, little things like that. Even applying lens correction, which I don't think I'm going to here. I'll get back to that. But these are some of those settings that you can apply right out the gate to every image before you go. Now, if I want to save a preset, Shift, Command, or Control N, and I can put this preset in my group called My Presets, and I already have one that's called Starting Point, but I'll name this one Starting Point as well. And I can go through and select all the settings, but I want to make sure to uncheck white balance, exposure. I absolutely want to uncheck graduated and radial filters. I don't want to put local adjustments in this preset. I don't want transform to come into it, but all the other aspects, I don't have any of these other settings applied, but you can have them checked. It doesn't matter for the moment at least. So I can go ahead and hit create. And now what I can do is I can go into develop mode and I can apply this preset to all the images or any sets that I specifically want. I can click on saved preset, my preset, and click on starting point. And now all these images will immediately have that starting point applied. So each image has those same settings. So that type of efficiency in applying those global settings is huge, right? So if you want to install a preset, maybe you purchased one from a third party, not a problem. You can go into Develop module, go to File, choose Import Develop Profiles and Presets. So you can install profiles as well. We'll get back to those in just a moment. But what I like to do specifically for lens correction, when I talk about applying presets, is I like to make presets per lens. So I can break this down more specifically, like if I want the 24 to 70 to have a specific lens correction, right? I want to fix that little bit of distortion that's happening, but I don't want to lose that vignetting. I like the vignetting. So I can create a preset specifically for the 24 to 70 lens correction under my presets. So I can just do 001. Oh, I can actually do 010. Oh, underscore 2470. Perfect. And I can check none, and I'll just make sure that lens correction is selected. So now I can go to this specific lens and apply those settings to only this lens. Now, I'll show you real quick why you can't customize lens correction like that between lenses. Because instead of the default settings applied here, we are doing custom settings, right? So we're only fixing the distortion, and it's pretty mild. So if I wanted to apply that same preset to, like, let's say the 50mm lens, if I apply that, what it's going to do is it's going to apply the 24 to 70 correction, which doesn't make any sense. I want the 50mm correction on, but I absolutely want the vignetting off. So I would do the same thing here. I would create a 011 underscore 50 millimeter lens correction. And you don't only have to do this per lens, of course, but it has to be done because you are doing custom settings. So then I could come in here and apply that to all of the images that are the 50mm, right? So you do that per camera. So that way you could come in here and have that same, just the distortion hitting, and maybe you'd want to bring the vignette, out some, but that custom setting would have to be done per lens, just to give you a heads up. Same thing you'd do probably for noise reduction and things like that. So let's move on to the basic panel and get into some color correction editing. All right, finally we can get into the editing part, right? So this is the basic panel. Nothing basic about it. A lot that you can do to the image, right? We want to adjust the brightness of the image first, then we want to deal with color, then we want to jump into tonal or recovery settings. So to do the editing sliders, you basically just take your cursor over any one of these sliders and you can do the up and down arrows, right? You can also hold shift and it'll increase the adjustments, right? So without shift, I'm going up by 0.1 increments. Holding shift, I can go up by a third stop. That's pretty huge, right? So going through that's pretty straightforward. If you're not getting a highlighted response or the ability to do that, sometimes you have to shut Lightroom down, open it back up. If you're not getting the same ability to sort of hover the cursor over top of the adjustments, you can't really use scrolling and things like that with the sliders. You don't really have that ability at all, but that's okay. So if you're wanting to use some hotkeys to adjust these settings, you can use your comma or your period key to toggle between your different settings. So if I wanted to get to exposure, which I have it highlighted here, then I'm hitting the plus key. I can do that as well, and I can hit the period key to jump down, period key to go down, the comma to go up, right? Now this edit's looking pretty bad. Let me bring my exposure back down. My contrast. So these are just some quick ways to toggle between the settings. Of course, if you want to hold shift, you can do shift plus with the plus key, and that will increase the exposure quite a bit. I think this image is looking a little dingy here. So those are some quick ways to toggle to edit sliders. So you also have, of course, your before and after preview that we're seeing here, or you can do a single image and hit the backslash key. That will give you before and after. Pretty cool as well. So jumping into editing, for me, it's always exposure first, right? So if I'm at my starting point, I want to make sure the exposure is right. Now this is shot pretty well in camera, pretty close to where I want it to be, but you can see it already has this warming effect applied, of course, because I have a custom white balance. This should be as shot, of course, before we start, but you always want to get the exposure right. Once the exposure is good, then you can start to dial in temperature and tint, right? So once I have temperature and tint done, now I don't like, the highlights on the face, so I can zoom in here. Let's see here, hit the Y key. Yeah, let's zoom in here. It's a little soft. Can increase some of the sharpness or something like that in the detail on an image like this if I wanted to fix it. It's shot wide open, of course, but if I'm going through image to image, I want to make sure it's pretty tack sharp. So if I want to decrease contrast and use a tool, like maybe more specifically I'd like to use the tone curve. Tone curve is a definitely better alternative to the contrast slider. It can be a little bit heavy, but what you can do is you can use these pretty cool curve points here. And if we want to flatten the whites a little bit, but also add a little bit of contrast, we can. Just kind of showing that ability to kind of give some flat blacks here. It's kind of a cool creative edit. Maybe not something you'd want to do from a color correction standpoint, but everyone has their own style and their way to edit. But it can definitely add a little more tonality to this image here. Pretty subtle. I can bring back in some contrast if I want, but instead I would probably drop the black point if I wanted to increase some of that density, lifting the shadows, things like that. So jumping down into the presence panel, texture is a pretty new slider and feature of Lightroom. Kind of adds in a nice level of sharpening that doesn't affect the midtones or any of the kind of contrast like clarity does. Clarity kind of adds some of that contour and some kind of definition in the dark tones. So you definitely have some of those options. We have dehaze, of course. We can lift that to increase contrast, drop it down to kind of fix the image a little bit if the image has a little too much contrast in it. So presence panels are pretty important to use. You want to make sure that if you want to drop the saturation down overall, kind of give this image a little more drama, you can. I find the presence panels to be a pretty subjective and creative approach, so I usually keep these sliders the same as I'm editing for color correction, especially when I want to sync multiple images and going through. Like for instance, this specific scene as I'm syncing. I want to make sure the settings that I have applied going across the board. Now as you see, my presence sliders aren't applied, so you want to make sure. Those are being applied across the board. And those images are pretty consistent. Now, of course, he's got a pretty dark eye here. This is probably something where I'd go in and I would, dodge that part of his face. Something like that would help in an image like this. Kind of has a little more drama, especially with the hands too. Hands are kind of dark. So we'll turn that off. That's something that's a little more creative, of course, and would require a little more work. For a color correction image, I might want to bring the exposure up. And I can open up the shadows a little bit on that side of the face and bring back down the highlights. You got to be kind of careful in an image like this. You don't want to go too dark. Things like that. So jumping down to, when I'm done editing, of course, and I want to proof my images, I always want to make sure to go back into grid mode and kind of proof through the images. So if I wanted to make some global adjustments to these, I can. I can do that under the quick develop panel here. So if I want to hold shift and just brighten all these up slightly, I can. I can just click that arrow to do it. If I want to shift them all a little bit warmer, it's pretty simple to do. It'll take them from their actual current state and shift them all evenly rather than put them all to the same values, which wouldn't make any sense, right? If you did editing like this one in particular, this edit was like, 1 stop brighter and this was a half a stop brighter, it wouldn't make sense to make them both the same. But if you want to increase both of them a third stop, this one to 1 and a third stop, this one to, basically 3/4 of an exposure, 3/4 of a stop, that's what it would do across these images. To make sure that they kind of increase the same amount as you see here. That one went up 0.87. So that's a pretty useful term for syncing images as well as using the quick develop. Let's jump into the editing tips portion of this. I can jump into and show you some different options in the develop module to make editing even faster for you. Alright, so tip number 1 is going to be the match total exposure tool. I love this tool. So what I like to do is, in the case that I have my starting point applied, and I have this image edited to the place that I want to, and more specifically, like the exposure is where it needs to be, the white balance and all that is kind of dialed in. So maybe on an image like this, I would say, okay, pretty happy with the way the settings turned out. This image might be a little bit warm. Let's say this is exactly where I want it to be. Slightly darker, has a little bit of a kind of subdued dark tone here. So if I want to sync it to all of these images down to here, I can hold shift, select the last one, and I can do sync settings. Now, as we'll see, as these images update is it's not necessarily going to make all the exposures the same. It's going to make them all the same, like visually the same. It's going to make them all look um, basically all kind of match to the same adjustments that I have here, which don't really make sense, right? These images here get pretty warm. This image is still too dark. This image is slightly too dark. Some of these got a little, slightly brighter down here. Some of these are still dark. Here's a pretty awesome tool, right? So match total exposure. I select all of these. Oh, let's go back. These are already selected. This is my key image. There is a option, I think it's in, pretty sure I can do match total exposure in grid mode. But if it's not available for you in develop settings, match total exposure, they hide it here, right? The hotkey is Shift, Option, Command, or Control on a PC, and the letter M. So when I click on that, what it does is it shifts all of these exposures to within the same histogram. So if you're shooting in the same light, you have the subject in the same position, it immediately switches all of them. Now it's not perfect. This one's a little bit dark. Some of the white balances are off. Obviously my SyncNet settings need adjusted. This one really didn't get much adjusted, right? Let's go into that. Like for some reason, this didn't get the adjustment it needed to. And that's going to happen. It's not a perfect tool by any means, but if I select those two and do match total exposure, it's still pretty off. So you're still going to have to go in and make some adjustments. And that kind of brings in another option, right? So auto, which is kind of a no-no for most people, there's good times and bad times to use the auto feature in Lightroom. So if I wanted to use the auto feature in this particular scene, I might do it because I'm not sure if the tint is too, if the image is too green, if I like the way that it looks. Let me jump into one of these images right here. So if I have as shot white balance and I want this, I want the temperature to be auto, I can hold shift and double click on temp. And that immediately shifts to the auto, so it's going to kind of daylight balance. I can do the same thing for tint, and it can kind of give me those options. Now I can also use the pick a neutral target or the white point picker. And I can choose her dress. That's not going to work either. So as I increase the exposure a little bit, maybe this image is a bit too bright, excuse me, a bit too dark, I can take the temperature down. But using the auto feature for tint I find to be pretty helpful when you're not sure on where the lighting should be. But you can do the same thing on exposure. That's going to go kind of, auto exposure doesn't work too well. But those settings, using any of these, if you want to have perfect density, and it'll base it on the histogram, you can hold shift and double click on any of these sliders. So it'll give you an auto shadows. I don't think that makes sense. I kind of like the dramatic dark shadows, but that's how you can kind of use the match total exposure and the auto features as well as syncing. So usually I sync first, I'll do match total exposure, and then go through and make some adjustments real quick. But I mean, end of day, you're going through these images one by one, and you're going to edit them, right? So like this image is now too warm compared to the rest, so I'd probably want to sync those settings. But I don't necessarily want to sync the exposure settings because now it got a little too bright. So instead of, go back, I can sync, check none, just the white balance. So these images stay, and they're a little bit off. And we can do match total exposure, and it's going to brighten them up a little bit, but it's going to be off, still off a little bit. So I'll darken those. Those images look pretty good. And now we need to kind of shift all of these. You got to be careful with this tool because it will do this too, and take the images back. So not a problem. That's why we have the history panel. all I need to do is just undo that match total exposure, go back one step, and I'm done. So those tips can definitely help. And as you can see here, I've kind of lost the ability to hover between the images, the slider, so I can use my comma and plus or minus arrows to kind of adjust those. So now that we can look into the another really great tool is the target adjustment tool. So if I want to pull down these greens in the background, like this, the greens in this image are just insane. I can do that pretty quickly. So looking in this image, I can go into my HSL panel, and if I want to pull down the greens even more, I can do Shift, Option, Command, or Control S. That's going to grab saturation. I can desaturate. Wherever I click and drag down, it's going to desaturate those colors. So I can desaturate the greens and the yellows. Be mindful that yellows are in the skin tone as well. It's going to pull all of those down. And now I can do Shift, Option, Command, or Control L, which is luminance. And I can brighten up all of those green colors so they're just not so overbearing. And if I wanted to go in and shift anything in this image, like I felt like the hues in her skin need more red, I can go to the negative side to get rid of some of that. But you can really shift these images in a very creative way, but also correct some of those things, like some of the just nasty greens. We might not need to kill so much of the orange saturation. But you can also grab out some of this blue that's happening in his suit. As you can see, my blues and purples are going away. And now we can really correct this image from where it was here. Just kind of pulling some of that down. Now this is, again, HSL is a very subjective and very difficult tool to use and just sync across images. I mean, this would work across these images, of course. I could sync, check none, color settings, color adjustments, and it's going to sync all those adjustments across the board, which can help kind of remove that amplified look of the greens in the background. So I definitely like to use that tool when I want to fix the backgrounds and things like that. Now, of course, you have a very simple tool in the develop module is the V key to just take this image and go to black and white. Then you can also do Shift Command. I think the target adjustment tool for let's see. It's G. So if you want to go through and do that same kind of thing for target adjustment tool to really dial in the settings of the black and white, you can. And that's where something where you'd go in, and I like to use the auto feature for the basic panel to get my black and whites at get the density perfect for those. But of course, you can hit the V key and it will bring it right back to where you had it before. So a lot of tips for going through the editing panel, the basic panel and editing and the develop module. I like to simplify things and kind of reduce down the different. Let's toggle these real quick. Kind of have my panels a little more reductive. I don't need to have the history panel showing and all that all the time. But you definitely have a lot of features in here where you can go in here, and if I wanted to really kind of amplify the oranges there, drop the blues, and of course kind of make those tones brighter. You got to be careful because it's definitely affecting the bride. on an image like this. You want to make sure that you're not just messing with the background, but you're also messing with the bride as well. So HSO, definitely want to make sure it's an all or nothing type of adjustment. So make sure you're not affecting the skin tones above and all. So let's get to the results and talk about what we're doing. Now, there's no doubt color correction is going to take some time to do. So for 1,100 images, you should be right around, I don't know, 3 to probably 3.5 hours of editing. I mean, that would be about how long it would take. So it's definitely, by no stretch are you going to be able to edit 1,100 images in an hour just using presets and just syncing images, batch editing. If it were that easy, it would mean that you were probably shooting 100% in manual, which I highly suggest. Everything is controlled and simple for you to apply. You probably could get through a job in an hour or two like this, even with that many lighting changes and things like that, if you're controlling the light and shooting in manual. But like most of us, it's not that easy. It's going to take some time, so it definitely helps to work with presets, so that way from those presets you can dial in color. I know that can be a pain, but it really helps to work with different color profiles, which I talk about them a little bit for color correction because that's going to be applied, of course, in your preset. But profiles really come into play when you want to do some creative edits as well. But applying those different level profiles up front is going to be very important for color right out the gate. So that way you can make sure every image has that consistency and that kind of shift from the forefront. But from there, you're going to want to go in and adjust the brightness. That's so important. Exposure is always first. Then it's white balance. Then I do the tonal recovery and all the other stuff. So you want to make sure, presets bring and kind of tie everything together, but you want to make sure as you're editing, if you want to use the divide and conquer method, where you're going by serial numbers, creating samples, it definitely makes it easier and it makes consistency much more achievable, because you can do samples, sync those specific images, and it tends to go much faster for editing versus just editing all cameras together, syncing them. If you've got Canon and Nikon and Sony and Fuji, those settings won't sync the same way across them, so it helps to do samples up front. Of course, the divide and conquer method is massive. So now that we've done our culling, we've done our color correction, we are ready for the fun stuff. We're ready to do the creative editing. So definitely tune in to next month, my 5th part of this series in the 7-part series, How to Step Up Your Lightroom Game. We're going to go through the creative workflow, going from Lightroom to Photoshop, back into Lightroom, but also doing a lot of creative stuff in Lightroom itself, talking about creative workflows, virtual copies, how to be organized with all these creative edits, how to stack images and things like that. Definitely tune in next month as we jump into the creative edits.